How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed Beis, Daf Heart, Daf Lev, Daf 32 of Masechta Zevachim. On today's Daf, we begin the third parak of Masechta Zevachim, parak Kol HaPsulin. That is what we are doing today. We are beginning the third parak of Masechta Zevachim. We will begin, of course, with a Mishnah. That Mishnah will discuss Avodah done by a pasul person. We're going to define a few pasul people and define what happens if they participate in different parts of the Avodah, what is kosher, what is not. The Gemara then begins discussing Shechita bizar, the slaughtering of a korban done by a non-kohen. That will be the first topic of the Gemara, today's Gemara. Then we will discuss Shechita tamei, slaughter done by an impure individual. Section number 4 out of 5 is partial entry of tamei persons into the temple. That we're going to see today the opinion of Ula, discussing of Bia b'mikza shmei Bia, I think is what it is. Partial entry of one's body. So, for example, if somebody's tamei and they partially go into the Beis Hamikdash, is that considered enough to be chayev? What would you even be chayev? To what degree would you be chayev makas? Would you chayev kares? Anyways, we will discuss that, and finally, we will get to the sugya. Kind of not exactly directly, not exactly indirectly, but we will discuss the sugya of Tumah dechuya betzibur, of Tumah being sort of pushed off. We'll get to that at the end of the daf in a congregation. Chevre, that is what we have in store for us on Daf Lamed Beis of Masechta Zevachim. Here we go. All right, friends, we are going to begin on Daf Lamed Aleph Omid Beis at the new parak, at the new Mishnah of the new parak. Kol HaPsulin sheshachtu, all of the pasul people who slaughter korbans, shchitasin kshera, their shchita is kshera, shashchita kshera, because slaughter is permitted, is kosher, bizarim, with non-kohanim, uvanoshim, with non-men. Well, no, it doesn't say that. It says women. Excuse me. Uva avadim, and with excuse me, avodim, slaves, tamei, tamei, impure people. Vafilu b'kadshe kachim, and this holds true even for kadshe kadshin. Uvavad shelo yiyu tamei mnogin bebasar. Just make sure that if you're going to have a tamei person slaughtering a korban, make sure that they're not going to be touching the meat, because obviously then the meat will become tamei. But so long as they don't touch the meat, their shechita is technically kosher. And therefore, of course, we've been learning about pigul. If you slaughter and you have some kind of a kavana for eating it, so because they're kosher to slaughter, well then they have to slaughter it properly, and they shouldn't be thinking about chutz lizman or chutz limkomo. If they do, then it'll be pigul. Now, v'chulan shekiblu es adam chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo. Now, what if they did kabbalah sadam? The thing is that kabbalah, right, as we're going to see in the Gemara, mikabbalah va'elach mitzvahs kahuna, as I don't know if we've seen it before, but it's definitely come up in our discussions in the past, that once you get to, right, that when we say shechita is ksheira bizarre, that's just the shechita, or in the context of the Mishnah, all of these psulim, they can slaughter, but from Kabbalah and onwards, that has to be a kohen. So, v'chulin shekiblu es adam, in right, all of these psulim, if they did Kabbalah as adam, chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo, with machshava of chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, pigul machshavas. Im yesh dam nefesh yachzor kosher v'yikabel. Right, these pasul people are not allowed to do Kabbalah, Olacha, Zrika, and if they did, well, then you're going to want a kosher person, i.e. a kohen who's kosher to do avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. So you're going to want a kohen so if there's still dama nefesh, if there's still blood, but not just like leftover blood, like real squirty blood squirting out, well then, if a kohen can capture that and do kabbalah sadam and zrika sadam, etc., well then that will be okay. The machshava of the pasul people for kabbalah, halacha, zrika is irrelevant, and so long as there is still blood, dama nefesh, left in the neck of the animal, so then have a kosher kohen come and do kabbalah with what's left of the blood and follow through the zrika sadam. Kibela kosher, if a kosher, i.e. a kohen kosher, did kabbalah sadam, v'nasan the pasul, but then he gave the blood to a pasul fellow. Yachzer the kosher, so the pasul fellow should simply give it back to the kosher fellow. Kibab imino v'nasan the small yachzer limino. If kabbalah sadam was initially done with the right hand, which is correct, but then it was transferred to the left hand, which is incorrect, transfer it back to the right hand. If the kabbalah sadam was done with a holy vessel, a kli kodesh, but the blood was then transferred to an unholy vessel, a regular, unholy vessel, Yahweh the kli kodesh, return it to the holy vessel. Nishbach min hakli ala ritzpa, as we've seen before, if after the kabbalah sadam all the blood spilled out onto the floor, ve'asafo, and then a kohen collected it, cleaned it up, kosher. That blood is kosher, because we learned in a Mishnah in the previous parak that if the blood squirted directly onto the floor, there was no kabbalah sadam and klisharis, well then you can't collect the blood and use it. But if it was initially received in a klisharis properly and then spilled out onto the floor, it can be collected and used. Nasna al-gabi hakevesh, if the blood was, the zrika sadam was done on the ramp, right, onto the ramp of the mizbeach, that's not where it's meant to be thrown onto. Shalok neged yisod, or on the southeastern corner of the mizbeach that we discussed the other day, where there is no yisod over there. Nosan nitzanitonin lemata lemailon, v'sanitonin lemailon lemato. Dam that was meant to be thrown below the chut sikra was thrown above the chut sikra, and vice versa. Also, as we saw the other day, we had some diagrams. I'm not going to pull out those diagrams again today. I don't think that there's a need for it. We could just discuss them. There is going to be a diagram a little bit later, but we don't need these right now. I don't think we had them the other day. Also, any blood that was meant to be thrown inside the heichal, for example, Parlim Davashot Tzipor, Par Kohen Mashiach, the Chatos Apnimios of Yom Kippur, if the blood was thrown on the outside Mizbeach, or vice versa. Im yesh dam hanefesh, yachzor kosher v'yikabel. If there is still dam hanefesh, if there is still blood, good squirty blood left in the neck, then a kohen should redo kabbalah, should do kabbalah sadam with whatever is left, and then do the zrika sadam properly. That was the first Mishnah of the third parak of Masechta Zevachim. Now we are moving on to the Gemara and to the next section of the Daf, Shechita Bizar, when the slaughter is done by a non-kohen. Shechachatu, the evidence lo. If you look at the Mishnah, it says pasul shechachatu, that they slaughtered. It sounds like meh. We really would prefer that a kohen would do it, but okay, pasul shechachatu. If they did it, all right, fine, it's okay. Shechachatu the evidence sounds like it's b'di'evid. The chatchila lo. It doesn't say kol hapsulim shochtim. It doesn't say that. It says sheshachatu if they did it. It's not b'diavad, but okay, if they did it, then it's okay. We have a contradiction. V'shachat, that when the pasuk says v'shachat has been abakar lifnei Hashem, so v'shachat shchita b'zar ksheira. The pasuk says that slaughter is ksheira from a non-kohen. Shashchita ksheira b'zarim, because shchita is ksheira b'zarim, non-kohanim, v'noshim, women, v'avadim, slaves, v'tameim, and impure people. V'afilu b'kachim kachim, even if we're talking about holy of holies, right? Chatos, Asham, Ola. Oh, enu ela b'kahanim. Wait a second, but maybe shchita has to be done by a priest. Omar t'v'chi me'ayin basa. We say, well, why would you say that? What makes you think that shchita would have to be done by a priest? That when the pasuk says, that when the voice says, that you and your children with you, must guard your priesthood, for all things mizbeach. Could it be that all things mizbeach includes even slaughter? I had to add a few words there. That if you look at that pasuk by Shechita, it says, V'shachar has been abakar lifnei Hashem, v'krivu b'nei aharon ha'kehanim. When it only mentions kehanim in the verse when it comes to Kabbalah Saddam. When it says V'shachar has been abakar lifnei Hashem, it doesn't say anything about kehanim. Only when it says v'krivu, and we've learned already earlier in the Masechta, v'krivu is talking about Kabbalah Saddam. V'krivu b'nei aharon, and by Kabbalah Saddam is the first time we see in the pasuk b'nei aharon. So the point being that only mikabala va'elach mitzvah skuna. Right back in the Gemara, mikabala va'elach mitzvah skuna. Limer ala shchita sheksher b'chol udam. So only from Kabbalah, mikabala va'elach, only from Kabbalah Saddam and onwards is mitzvah skehuna. Needs to be done by a kohen. Limer ala shchita, but the step before that, which is the slaughter, sheksher b'chol udam, anybody can do that part. No. So what do we see from the Brisa? Who could tell me? Who could tell me what we see from the Brisa? What we see from the Brisa is that milchatchila. The pasuk says, "Stay in pasuk." V'shachar has been abakar lifnei Hashem v'krivu b'nei aharon. The pasuk says anybody can do the shechita. Mikabala v'elach mitzvah skuna. So why the tone in our Mishnah? Why is our Mishnah saying, how come? So, and for the Gemara, who adin da'afil l'chatchila nam. Taka, you're right, Taka. You're right. Anybody can do shchita milichatchila. Umishum de kaboy lemisna tmeim de lechatchila lo b'zeh shem yugu bebaser tana sheshachatu. Here is the thing. Here's the dilio. The dilio is that you are right that milichatchila shchita is kishera b'chol adam. The thing is listed in our Mishnah was also tamei. That a tamei person could do shechita. And while that's technically correct, we don't want tamei people doing shechita as out of concern that they might make the it's very reasonable to be concerned that a tamei person doing shechita may end up making the korban itself tamei if they touch the korban. So because, what does it say? It's because Mishum de kabay the Mishnah tamei, because we're going to list in the Mishnah tameim de lechatchila lo, that by tamei people, impure people, lechatchila, they don't do shechita because out of concern that they might end up touching the meat of the korban and making it tamei. So tana sheshachatu. So therefore, the Mishnah taught sheshachatu b'diavad kilu. So yes, a zar, a woman, a eved, all these people listed, it's lechatchila. You're right. The reason, however, the only reason why the Mishnah writes sheshachatu, which is b'di'eved, is not because of zar, nashim, avodim. It's because of tameim. Because tameim, really, it is b'di'eved. So because we were going to list tameim, which is b'di'eved, so it just mentioned a lashon b'di'eved for all of them. But you are right. It's really only b'di'eved for tameim, zar, nashim, avodim. They can all do shechita lichat chila. And now we get to the next section of the daf, which delves a shtickle deeper into the kashrus of a tamei person, shechita ing. Is it really so? Frag the Gemara. Asks the Gemara, is it really so that a tamei, an impure individual that slaughters a korban, it's technically b'di'eved, it's kosher? Ask the Gemara. Maybe it's completely pasul for a tamei person to slaughter. For a minute, we have a contradiction. V'samach v'shachad. This is going to come up in today's daf. It's going to come up in tomorrow's daf ochit. That the pasuk says, the pasuk that we just read about v'shachad as ben abakar lifnei Hashem v'kruv b'nei Aharon, right? The pasuk that we've been working with for the past few minutes. There is actually a pasuk, surprise, surprise, before that pasuk. That is not the first pasuk in Sefer Vayikra. There's a pasuk before that pasuk. The pasuk immediately before that pasuk is V'samach yodai al rosh ha'olav v'nitzlo l'chapra olav smicha. And then the very next pasuk says V'shachad es ben abak lifnei Hashem, etc. So it says V'samach, follow immediately in the next pasuk by V'shachat, and by V'shachat es ben abak it says lifnei Hashem. That the shechita is lifnei Hashem in the azara. Whoa. Well, if the shechita is happening, if we're juxtaposing smicha and shechita, right? It says the one pasuk says v'samach, the next pasuk says v'shachat, and by shechita it says lifnei Hashem, that this is happening in the azara. Well, friends, only pure people are allowed in the azara. So how can it possibly be that an impure person is allowed to slaughter? Slaughtering is lifnei Hashem. Is in the azar. Again, a tamei person who slaughters a korban, really, it's b'di'eved, it's kosher. We have a contradiction, v'samach v'shachat, that we juxtapose smicha and shechita. Ma smicha b'torim, just like smicha, because we juxtapose smicha and shechita, right? V'samach, and then it says v'shachar has been a bakar lifnei Hashem, and by shechita it says lifnei Hashem. We juxtapose shechita and smicha and shechita. So therefore, because smicha has to be lifnei Hashem, right? Because we assume that lifnei Hashem applies to both. So because smicha needs to be lifnei Hashem, so memele it has to be by a pure person. Because if the smicha is happening lifnei Hashem in the azara, only pure people are allowed in the azara. So masmicha b'torim, just like smicha is going to be by a tahor individual, av shechita b'torim. So also the shechita must be done by tahor individuals. So it sounds like from there that the shaychit would have to be tahor. It cannot be tamei midrabanan. That requirement from this smicha shechita is only midrabanan, right? The requirement for the shaychit to be tahor, and that the shaychit cannot be tamei, that's only midrabanan. Midoraisa, the shaychit can be tamei as long as he doesn't touch the meat. Ma'ishna smicha, now fact the Gemara, Ma'ishna smicha dichsiv lifnei Hashem, shchita nam yoksiv lifnei Hashem. But we're saying, but one second, if we're assuming, right, we said that the pasuk says v'samach v'shach masmicha b'tarim, sa'af shchita b'tarim, right? So we had said, well, since smicha needs to be by a tahor person, so then shchita should also have to be by a tahor person. It can't be tamei. So we said, no, shchita can be tamei, just midrabanan should have to be tahor. But one second, why we said that smicha needs to be by a tahor person? Why are we maintaining that smicha must be done by a tahor person, but shechita doesn't need to be done by a tahor person? The requirement to be done by a tahor person is only midrabanan. But why the distinction? Why are we assuming that smicha, which is juxtaposed to shechita, smicha needs to be by a tahor person, Shechita doesn't have to be by a Torah person. Again, why does smicha have to be by a Torah person? Tichsiv lifnei Hashem, because it says lifnei Hashem. Now, technically, actually, lifnei Hashem is at the next person by the next pasul by the Shechita, actually. But again, the lifnei Hashem applies to both. So we're saying that the v'samach smicha needs to be tahor because it's lifnei Hashem. It's in the Azara. Well, Shechita nami yoksiv lifnei Hashem. By the Shechita also it says lifnei Hashem. It actually really says lifnei Hashem, strictly speaking, in the context of the Shechita. So why are we saying that while the smicha must be by a tahor, the Shechita doesn't have to be by a Torah person? Well, because Efsher to Ovid Sakin Arucha V'Shachit. Well, because yes, the Shechita needs to be done in the Azara. You're right. But technically you can make a very long knife, or at least maybe a very long handle for a knife, whatever it is. You could technically have a tamei person stand outside of the Azara with a very long knife and slaughter the korban that is in the Azara. So even though it says lifnei Hashem by Shechita, you can technically kind of have a workaround. Smicha nami efshir d'mayil yod v'samich. But one second, but by smicha also, can't you do something similar? Stand outside of the Azara, stick your hands into the Azara. This is already segueing into the next section of today's daf, partial entry of tamei persons into the temple. But anyways, so can't you do something similar by smicha and you can have a tamei person doing smicha, just stick their hands into the azar and lean on the animal that way. Well, because the author of the Brisa assumes that partial entry into the azara would be considered like complete entry, i.e., you wouldn't be able to have a tamei person stand outside the azara, stick his hands into the azara just to lean on the animal, because partial entry into the azara is considered like complete entry, like the tamei person went into the azara, and that is not allowed. Rav Chizda Taka teaches this the opposite way, right? Instead of assuming that smicha must be by a Torah person and shechita can be by a tamei person, Rav Chizda teaches his punkt fakir. V'samach v'shachat ma'shchita b'torin af smicha b'torin. Just like shechita must be done by a tahor person. I guess this brisa would, argue on the notion that a tamei person could do shechita. But just like the shechita must be by a tahor person, af smicha b'torin, so then also smicha needs to be by a tahor person. Ma'ishna shechita tichsiv lifnei Hashem. Now by smicha it says, and I guess that smicha though we're saying that maybe that would only be midrabanan though. I guess b'diavad it doesn't have to be by a Torah person. But mashna shechita tichsiv lifnei Hashem. Why does shechita have to be done by a Torah person? Because it says lifnei Hashem. Smicha nami ksiv lifnei Hashem. Yeah, but smicha also, it says lifnei Hashem. So if we're assuming that shechita has to be by a Torah person that says lifnei Hashem, so in smicha should have, if shechita has to be by a Torah person that says lifnei Hashem, so smicha should have to be by a Torah person. Yes, but esher d'mayil yodei v'samich. So according to this version, smicha doesn't technically have to be done by a Torah person, because you can have a tamei person just stick his hands into the azara and do smicha that way. And according to this version, that would be okay. You wouldn't say bia b'mitzvah shema bia. Shechita nami efshir David sakin arucha v'shachit. Okay, but then why can't you have shechita done by a tamei person? He'll just stand outside of the azar with a long knife. Hamani Shimon atimnihi. Well, because this brisa is Shimon atimni, the sanya that we learned in the brisa v'shachit has been a bakar lifnei Hashem. According to the Tanakama, it says the ben abakar needs to be lifnei Hashem. That the cow needs to be before in the azar. But the slaughterer doesn't technically need to be in the azar. However, Shimon atimni Omer says Shimon atimni minayin shehu yadav shel hashoichet lifnei min hanishchat. Says Shimon atimni, actually the hands of the shoichet, i.e. the shoichet himself, needs to be even more in the azara than the cow itself that's being slaughtered. So, says Shimon HaTimni, Take, the shochet does need to be in the azara, and therefore the shochet would have to be tahor. Tamalama v'shochet has been abakar lifnei Hashem. Shochet has been abakar yeh lifnei Hashem. That the slaughterer of the cow must be before Hashem, must be in the azara, and therefore, because according to Shimon HaTimni, the shochet needs to be in the azara, and therefore must, of course, be tahor in order to go into the azara. However, according to this version, in terms of smicha, it would be acceptable to just stick one's hands into the azara and do smicha that way, which is kind of which is now a segue into the next section of today's daf. Partial entry of tamei persons into the temple. This is a sugya that is going to take us into tomorrow's daf as well. Anyways, here we go. Amar Ula says, Ula Amar Rish Lakish in the name of Rish Lakish. Tamei shehichnis yado lifnim loke. Says Ula in the name of Rish Lakish that a tamei person who sticks his hands into the azara is going to receive makis shenemar, as the pasuk says, bechol kodesh lo siga, and then the pasuk then continues and it says vela mikdash lo savo v'gomer makis bia l'negia, that we compare vela mikdash lo savo. This is a pasuk by a yoledes, that by a yoledes, so let's say she gives birth to a boy, so then for the first 7 days she will be tamei. At the end of 7 days, she goes to the mikvah. Then she's what's called a tfulas yom aruch, a very long tful yom, because she's then going to be, of course, for the next 33 days, for a total of 40 days. So then for the next 33 days, she's going to be demei tahara. She's tahara, but she's be'etzem until on day 41. She's then, and for a girl on day 81. So on day 41 for a boy, she's going to bring or korbanos, and basically at the end of day 40. She becomes, right, she's no longer a tvulas yom. She is mechuseres kippurim, and then on day 41 she brings her korbanis, and then she's completely pure. So now the pasuk says during that time when she's a tvulas yom aruch, it says bichol kodesh lo siga. She shouldn't touch, as a tvulas yom aruch, she shouldn't touch any kodshim. Vela mikdash lo savo. And she shouldn't go into the Beis Hamikdash. Makash bia l'negia. We compare going into the Beis Hamikdash to touching Kodesh. Manegia b'miktzas shma negia. Just like partial touching of Kodesh is called Kodesh. I assume in my mind, what it means is like you don't have to touch the whole korban, just even touching it a little bit. She shouldn't do. So abia b'miktzas shma bia. Also, she shouldn't even go into the Beis Hamikdash a little bit as a tvulas yom aruch, and therefore, says Ula in the name of Rish Lakish, if a tamei person does even partially go into the Beis Hamikdash, they will be chayev makis for violating v'chol kodesh lo siga v'la mikdash lo savu. Eizvei Rav Oshaya le'ula. So Rav Oshaya asked an interesting question to Ula. What's so interesting about this question? So first of all, a tamei person that goes into the Beis Hamikdash is chayiv kares. This is learned out from the pasuk. I think this is going to be on when is this pasuk? I think maybe this pasuk is taka. What pasuk is this on? This is and what daf is it? This is on tomorrow's daf. Pasuk says, I'm going to read you a pasuk from tomorrow's daf. Kol nogeh b'meiz b'nefesh ha'adam sheyomas v'lo yischata as mishkan Hashem timei v'nichriso ha'nefesh ha'yisrael. Kimeni de lo zor kol tamei u'tamazabo. A tamei person who goes into Beis Hamikdash is chayiv kares. And the assumption right now is that when Ula says that a tamei person who even partially enters into the Beis Hamikdash is going to be chayiv makis, the assumption is that, I guess if he wasn't warned and it was done intentionally, he would be chayiv kares. That's at least the assumption for now. Eis Rav Hoshaya asked a kasha le'ula against Ula. Mitzora. If you have a mitzora, somebody who had saras, and they were thrown out of all three camps, Machne Shechina, Machne Levia, Machne Yisrael, they were thrown out of all the camps. And then the tsaras went away, so they were allowed back they went to the mikvah, and and they killed birds, and I think maybe also cut off all the hair and everything. Then they're allowed into the camp, they wait there for a week. And then on day 8, they bring korbanos. And then on day 7, they go to the mikveh, and then they also shave their head and everything, I think. Anyways, but then on day 8, they go to the Beis HaMikdash, and they bring a korban osham, a korban chatos, I believe a korban ola as well. And then from the blood of the korban osham, they put it on their thumbs, on their ears. Exciting times. So now what happens if you have Mitzvah Shechol Shvi Shelo? So day 8, Mitzvah Shechol Shmini Shelo, day 8 of the Mitzvah, the day of the Korbanis. Shcholios Be'erev Pesach falls out on Erev Pesach. Okay, so obviously we're thinking about the Korban Pesach. So you have the Mitzvah. It's day 8 of being a Mitzvah. It's also Erev Pesach. And he's going to want to be able to eat. Right? The question is he going to be able to eat the Korban Pesach that night? Well, why not? He's got to bring his Korban Osham, Chatos, Ola that day. And we'll take some of the blood of the Korban Osham, we'll put on his ears and things like that. We'll take care of him. And then sure, he can eat the Korban Pesach that night. Okay. So Mitzvah Shechol Shmini Shelo Lios Be'erev Pesach, but there was a hitch. A hitch? I think it's a hitch. Like there was a bump in the road, a curveball. V'ra'a keri bo bayom v'toval. Dagnabbit. He became a Balkari. So a Balkari, we compare Balkari to Zav, says Rashi, or at least that's the assumption right now. Well, yes, I think we compare Balkari can't go into the Beis HaMikdash. He goes to the mikvah and has a tefuyom, but a tefuyom also, right? We said tefuyom of a zav. We said the other day tefuyom of a zav is kizav, so also tefuyom of Balkari is like a Balkari. So now he's not allowed to go into the Beis HaMikdash. He's not allowed to go into the Beis HaMikdash. So now what happens? What do you do? It's day 8 of being a Mitzvah. Well, day 8 of the purification, this stage of the purification process of Mitzvah. He's got to come to the Beis HaMikdash and bring his Korbanos. It's also Erev Pesach, and everyone's concerned about the Korban Pesach. And now he becomes a Balkari. He goes to the mikvah, but he's a Tvul Yom the entire 8th day. So what do you do? You need to offer the korban. He's a mitzorah. He needs to offer his korbanos in order to be able to eat the korban pesach that night. By that night, he'll be completely pure. He's a balkari. He'll go to the mikvah. By that night, he'll be fine. The problem is that in order to be able to eat the korban pesach, he's going to have brought his korbanos for the day 8 of being mitzorah, but he can't go into the Beis HaMikdash if he's a balkari or even tvul yom of a balkari. So now what happens? So again, so day 8 of this stage of the purification of the Mitzvah falls out to be Erev Pesach. For a Keri Babble Yom, now he sees Keri on that day. V'tavel, he goes to the mikvah, but he's still going to be a Tvul Yom the entire 8th day now. Well, the 8th day, which is Erev Pesach. So the Chacham said, Af al pisha ein Tvul Yom acher nichnas. Look, even though generally speaking, a Tvul Yom is not allowed to go into Har Abayis. A Tvul Yom of a Balkari, at least, I don't know about all Tvul Yoms, but Tvul Yom of Balkari would not be allowed to go into Har Abayis. Zen Nichnos. But in this case, he can go into Har Abayis. Mutav Yavo Ese Sheyesh Bo Karis because let a mitzvahs essay that has a chiyuv kares associated with it, i.e. korban pesach, right? If somebody does not bring the korban pesach, it's chayiv kares. So korban pesach is a mitzvahs essay to bring the korban pesach, that if you don't do it, if you neglect to do the korban pesach, you chayiv kares. V'yitcha essay shein bo kares, let that be docha mitzvahs essay that doesn't have kares, right? Going into hara bayis, we're not talking about the azar right now. So maybe I'll pull out this slide right now. Right, here's a slide here that really I have this slide here for Shar Nicanor. What daf is this? Daf 32? What do I have for tomorrow? Do I have the same slide for tomorrow? What do I have for tomorrow? What's this? Anyways, okay, I don't even know what I need this for. But anyways, looking at this slide, you see two things. So the arrow there is pointing to Shar Nicanor or whatever, but that whole area surrounded by blue, that's the first. So the first part of it, kind of, you see the map there of the image on the bottom left, right? The compass looking thing. So the bottom is Mizrach, the left is Darum, the top is Ma'ariv, the right is Tzofan. So at the bottom of that blue rectangle is the east. That is where you enter in to first the Ezras Noshim. That's the first half of the blue rectangle. And the second half of the blue rectangle, you walk through Shar Nicanor and you get into the Azara. But that whole square surrounding that whole blue rectangle area, that whole bigger square is Har HaBayis. That's what we're talking about right now. That a Balkari going into Har HaBayis, there's just the mitzvah's essay of Vishalchu Michutz Lamachne. You have to send him out. But there's no chiyuv kares. If he goes into the Azara, if you would go into the Azara, where the white arrow is, there's Shar Nicanor. If you would walk through first Ezras Nashim, then walk through Shar Nicanor into the Azara, then there would be a chiyuv kares for a tamei person going into the Azara. But to go into Har HaBayis, it's just a mitzvah's essay. So therefore, says, who is this, Rav Oshaya? Well, it says the Brisa that you have this Mitzaru who's a Balkari, he went to the mikveh, but he's still a Tvul. So let him come to offer his karbanis on the day 8 of this stage of his purification, so that he can eat Korban Pesach that night, because Korban Pesach is mitzvah's essay that is a chiyuv kares, as opposed to a simple mitzvah's essay of a Balkari is not allowed on Har HaBayis. Rabbi Yochanan says actually technically there isn't even a mitzvah's essay about a Balkari being or a Tvul Yom being in Har HaBayis. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Dvar Torah that actually midoraisa afilu essay ein bo. Technically there isn't even a mitzvah's essay to send out a Tvul Yom from Har HaBayis. Remember the square area surrounding the blue area, right? The Azara, but on Har HaBayis. So afilu essay ein bo shenemar, the pasuk says in Divrei Yomim, Vayamud Yoshafat Bekal Yehuda of Yerushalayim. Yoshafat stood up in the congregation of Judah in Jerusalem, Bebeis Hashem in the house of God, Lifnei Chatzar Achadasha, before the new gate. My Chatzar Achadasha, what's the new gate? Rabbi Yochanan, or a different gears it says Rebbe. Shechita Badvarim, that they made a new halacha. Ve'amu Tvul Yom Hayikonis HaMachne, and they decided that a Tvul Yom can't go into Machne Leviyah. And Har HaBayis would be Machne Leviyah, right? Machne Shechina, I guess, would be... Wait, Machne Leviyah... Wait, what's Machne Shechina? Is Machne Shechina also the Azara is already considered Machne Shechina, or is that specifically the Kodesh HaKadoshim? In my mind, Machne Shechina was after like the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but... maybe not. Maybe it's anywhere in the Azara. But anyways, I guess certainly the Har HaBayis argues Rabbi Yochanan that was an innovation. Okay, fine. So technically, in terms of a Tvul Yom being on Har HaBayis, says Rabbi Yochanan, technically that isn't even a violation of mitzvah essay. But anyways, okay. So where are we? We're about to get to actual what the question is. But here's what we have so far. What we have so far is that Ula says that if a tamei person sticks their hands into the Azara, Bia, b'miktas shma Bia. You're not allowed to do that, you'd be chayiv makis. The assumption is also if you do it on purpose and there was no warning or anything, you'd be chayiv kares. Now here's the thing. We have this scenario with this Mitzora on his 8th day, he has to bring his korbanos, but it's also Erev Pesach. Now he becomes a Balkari. He goes to the mikvah, but now he's at Tvul Yom. And we say, you know what, he can offer his korbanos. He can offer his korbanos because we want him to be able to participate in the Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach mitzvahs esse as a chiyuv kares. This Balkari, doing his purification for a Mitzora, is never going to violate anything that's a chiyuv kares. However, now here's the question though. But 1 second, Ula, you say that partial entry is considered entering into the Beis HaMikdash. How can he put his hands into the Azar for the Bahoinis? Who they are both chiyuv kareses. Wow. So this is why I actually have this slide here. This is why I have this slide here about Shar Nikanor. The reason I have that white arrow pointing to that basically if you look at the blue rectangle, that blue rectangle is made up of two parts. The first, if you enter into the blue rectangle from the bottom, which is the east side, you first go into what's called the Ezras Nashim. If you walk through the Ezras Nashim and get up to where that white arrow is, that right arrow is pointing to a gate called Shar Nikanor. Walking through Shar Nikanor, you then get into the Azar. Now, a Mitzora, here's the interesting thing about a Mitzora. A Mitzora, he's gone to the mikvah already, and it's now day 8. He went to the mikvah already the day before. He's no longer at Tvul Yom or anything, but he's in Mechusar Kippurim. He hasn't yet offered his korbanos yet. Right, and as we saw by the Yoledis, right, Vela Mikdash Lo Savo, she's Ad Milos Yimei Torah. Right, that as a Tfulas Yom, Aruch, well, she was not right as a Tfulas Yom, she can't go. But even until a Mechusar Kippurim, I don't know if it's enough from that pasuk, but even a Mechusar Kippurim can't go in to the Azar. A Mechusar Kippurim can't go into the Azar. So what does the Mitzora do? So what does the Mitzora do? So interestingly, the Shar Nikanor, they did it. So the width of the Shar Nikanor, is not kadosh with the same kedusha as the Azar itself. So what happens is you have this delicate scenario where you have this Mitzora who's a Mechusar Kippurim. He hasn't yet offered his korbanos yet. But as part of offering his korbanos, they need to take the blood from the korban ashram and put it on his ears and his thumbs. So what you have is this Mitzora who's a Mechusar Kippurim. It's day 8. He's got to offer his korbanos. He's allowed to go into Har HaBayis, walk through the Ezras Nashim to the Shar Nikanor, and he stands in the Shar Nikanor. He doesn't go into the Azar because he's a Mechusar Kippurim. He's not allowed into the Azar. But he stands in the Shar Nikanor, which is what the white arrow is pointing to. He sticks his hands into the Azara so that the Kohen could put the blood of the Asham onto his hands. So we see that the Mitzora is sticking his hands, i.e. part of his body, into the Azara. So this is Bia B'Miktzas. Part of his body is going into the Azara. Now now we had the scenario of this Balkari. And the whole logic to say that, even though he's a Mechusar, even though he's a Balkari and he went to the mikvah, now he's a Tvul Yom, what do we do? It's a Pesach, we want him to bring the Korban Pesach. We say, look, Pesach is an essay that does not have any kares involved. I'm sorry, Pesach is an essay that has kares involved. The Tvul Yom, going into doing whatever he has to do as a Mitzora, there's not going to be any kares. But 1 second. According to Ula, who says that Bia B'Miktzas Shma Bia, that even partially entering into the Azara is considered like you entered into the Azara, well then the Tvul Yom who's tamei, putting his hands into the azara so that the blood of the ashram can go on his thumbs. Well, that's bia b'mikzas shema bia. That also has a chiyuv kares. So why are we saying no? Go for it, because Korban Pesach has a chiyuv kares, and the tvul yom he's not encountering anything with kares. What do you mean? According to Ula, bia b'mikzas shema bia, and he's going to have to stick his hands into the azar so that blood can be put on his thumbs. That should also be a chiyuv kares. Why are we saying that it's not? Rather, it's a kasha and Ula. It sounds rather like actually sticking your hands into the azara is not a chiyuv kares. Bia b'mikzas lo shema bia. It sounds like partially entering is actually not that big of a deal. It's not like you actually entered into the azara. You hear the question? So Ula had said that partially entering into the azara is considered entering into the azara, but from this situation with the tvul yom of Keri being able to stick his hands into the azara, we don't say it's a chiyuv kares. Sounds like it's not actually considered like he went into the azar. Omar le mitunach, to which Levi answers, one second. Maybe some of the Chevra at Babble and Talmud was thinking the same thing. One second. This isn't just a regular tvul yom going into the Beis Hamikdash and sticking his hands into the azar. This is a metzora that we're talking about. As it is, the metzora is a mechusar kippurim, and when it comes to metzora, he's allowed to stick his hands into the azara. It's just that's part of the way that it goes. And even though a mechusar kippurim is not allowed to go into the azara, for a metzora, we waive it. So mitunach, from that exact mitunach, technically means what? From like how does Rashi explain it? From that same burden that you tried to put on me, I'm going to put on you. Look, we're talking about a mitzora. Here you have a person who has tsaras, and he's not yet fully purified, and we're allowing him to come into the Beis Hamikdash and stick his hands into the azara. These are things that would normally not be allowed. But because it's in the context of Mitzorah, something that is not normally allowed is allowed. And he's allowed to stick his hands into the Azar. So argues Ula, look, Bia b'mitzvah shma bia. Partial entry is like full entry. But it's waived so that, in the context of Mitzorah, so as part of his purification process. And we're allowing this Mitzorah, who's not fully pure, to stick his hands into the Azar. Guess what? We're also going to allow this Balkari, who already went to the mikvah and he's a Tvul Yom. He can also stick his hands in as a mitzora, because as a mitzora, these tumas are waived as part of the purification process, and that's why it's allowed. So even if we're going to say that bia makes us shma bia, and technically he should be chayiv kares as a tvul yom, sticking his hands into the azar, but because he's a mitzora, built into the purification process of mitzora is the acknowledgement that even though he's tamei, he's allowed to stick his hands into azara. So the question really isn't a question, argues Ula. And now we get up to the final section of today's daf, which I've labeled as Tumah dechuya b'tzibor. It's not directly a sugya of Tumah dechuya b'tzibor, but it will play a large role. Here we go. We're gonna explain what that is and its relevance in a second. Amar of Yosef says of Yosef, Kasavar Ula, Ruban Zovim v'naisu tamei mesim, oil v'hutru l'tum ason, hutru l'zivason. All right, exciting times over here. Okay, we learned the other day that when it comes to Korban Pesach, right? Korban Pesach, of course, if one is tamei, well, specifically if one is tamei mace, so then they would not bring the if you're tamei mace, so you don't bring the Korban Pesach. Instead, in a month from now, Pesach Sheni, you'll bring the Korban Pesach. However, we said if most of Am Yisrael is tamei mace, so then we had said Tumah hutra b'tzibur. We're going to be referring to as Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. Okay, we'll get there soon. But basically, if most of Am Yisrael, if the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei tumas hameis, so then they don't all wait till Pesach Sheni in a month from now. Rather, you bring all the congregation brings the Korban Pesach now. But that's specifically for tumas hameis. Other tumas, we had talked in the past about tumas sheretz. But here we're talking about tumas tsaras, tumas negoyim. Tumas negoyim would not be mutter to bring the korban pesach, even if the majority of Am Yisrael was tamei with tsaras. They would not be allowed to bring the korban pesach. They would have to bring pesach sheni. So now Ula had this interesting. So Ula had just said a second ago, right? He said bia b'mikzas shema bia. What about this Mitzora, who's also a Balkari, who went to the mikveh as a Tfuyom? We say, well, since he's allowed to stick his hands into the Azara as a Mitzora, he's also allowed to stick his hands into the Azara as a Tfuyom. So Rav Yosef wants to argue that based on that sort of concept of like, well, since it's permitted for this, it's also permitted for that other thing also. Well, then let's say that if the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei tumas tsaras, and they would have to bring Pesach Sheni, it wouldn't be allowed for them to just bring Pesach Rishon, even though the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei, because that's tumas ameis, is tumas tsaras. But then they also become, majority of Am Yisrael becomes tamei tumas ameis. Now tumas ameis, they would be allowed to bring the korban pesach now, if the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei tumas ameis. So Rav Yosef wants to argue that based on this concept that Ula just laid out, that well, since it's allowed for Mitzorah, it's allowed for Tvul Yom. Well, let's say that since Am Yisrael could bring korban pesach when the majority is tumas ameis, they'll also now be able to, right? Basically, the tumas tsaras. Wait, oh no, this was zavin, right? Not tsaras. Tumas ziva. So this tumas ziva would also be waived, so to speak, and they would be allowed to bring the korban pesach now. So Amar Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef Kosavar Ula holds, so Ula would hold, Kilu. Rav Yosef says, based on Ula, we would say that he would hold. Ruban Zavim, that if the majority of Am Yisrael Zavs, and therefore they would all have to bring Pesach Sheni, but V'naisu Tamei Mesim, but then most of Am Yisrael becomes Tamei Tumas HaMeis, which technically would allow them to bring the Korban Pesach now. So hold V'huchu L'Tumason, Huchu L'Zivason, since they are allowed to bring the Korban Pesach now as Tamei Mesims, so also, even though they're also Zavs, it's okay. They could bring the Korban Pesach now, right? Just like Ula had said, since a Mitzorah is allowed to stick his hand to the Azara, even though he's also now a Tvuyom, it's okay. He could still stick his hands into the Azara. So here also, we'll say, since their majority are Tamei Mesim, they could bring the Korban Pesach now, and even though they're also Zavs, it's okay. Amalei Abaye Midami. Abaye says, one second. These are not compatible. These are not similar. Tumah ishtaroi, ziva lo ishtaroi. Abaye says, wait, these are not similar, because while the tumah is permitted, the ziva is not. Right? Meaning, the majority of Am Yisrael was tamei tumas ziva, right? And they're all a bunch of zavs. Most of our Am Yisrael was tamei tumas ziva, and as zavs, they were not allowed to bring the korban pesach. They had to wait a month until Pesach Sheni. And what just happened? They became even more tamei. The majority of Am Yisrael now became tamei tumas hameis, even more. Before they were tamei tumas ziva. Now, in addition to that, they're also tamei tumas hameis. So while yes, technically Tumas HaMeis is something that would allow them to bring the Korban Pesach now, but it's not going to do anything about the fact that they already had Tumas Ziva. Kilu, they were tamei Tumas Ziva. They are not allowed to bring the Korban Pesach now because they're all a bunch of Zavs. They have to wait a month. They become even more tamei. Now they become tamei Tumas HaMeis, and that's all of a sudden somehow going to allow them to bring the Korban Pesach. They just became even more tamei than they were before. And even though, yes, the Tumah that was added on is Tumas HaMeis, which technically they could bring the Korban Pesach as Tamei Mesim, but that's not going to do anything to allow the fact that they were, to undo the fact, to do anything about the fact that they were already Zavs. So therefore it says, Abai says to Rav Yosef Midamar, there's similar Tumah Ishtaroi in this scenario by the Korban Pesach, while yes, Tumas HaMeis is allowed, right? The Am Yisrael could bring Korban Pesach when the majority is Tamei Tumas HaMeis, but Ziva Lo Ishtaroi, in this case, they were already Zavs from beforehand. That is not going to be permitted. You can skip the next two words if you want. Dilma Ochi Ka'amar Mar. Abai suggests to Rav Yosef, maybe this is what you meant. Ruban Tamei Meisim, that if the majority was already Tamei Meisim, that if the majority of Am Yisrael was Tamei Tumas HaMeis, and as being Tamei Tumas HaMeis, they were allowed to bring the Korban Pesach. V'naisu Zavim, and then they became Zavs. In that case, you could say, well, since they were already in a state where even though they were tamei, they were still allowed to bring their korban pesachs, and now they become zavs, we'll say, look, we're talking about korban, right? Meaning, in this case, we're saying that we're going to saying that for ula, it's going to be similar to the mitzorah case. Here you have this person, he's a mitzorah, and as a mitzorah, even though he's a mechusar kippurim, he's allowed to stick his hands into the azara. And now he's also not just a mitzorah, but he's also a tvuyam. And we're saying, well, even though he's got tumas mitzorah, he's allowed to stick his hands into azara. Therefore, even though he's now also a tvuyam, it's okay. As a mitzorah, he's allowed to stick his hands into azara, even though he's also a tvuyam now. It's okay. As a mitzorah, he's allowed to do it. So he also was saying, when it comes to korban pesach, they were tamei tumas hameis. But when it comes to korban pesach, the tamei tumas, if the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei tumas hameis, they're allowed to bring the korban pesach. Now they're also become zavs. We were already in the scenario where they were already tamei, and they were saying, yeah, but by korban pesach this tumah is allowed. So we're saying that, well, now they're also zavs, but we're already in the scenario where by the korban pesach tumah, yes, they're tamei, but they're still allowed to bring the korban pesach, and even though they're now zavs, we're already in the scenario where as tamei people they're allowed to bring the korban pesach, and even as zavs we'll say it's also okay. But so Amalei in. So Rav Yosef says, yeah, that's what I meant. Meaning, it's not talking about where they were zavs and they weren't allowed to bring the korban pesach, and then they become even more tamei by being tamei tumas hameis, and all of a sudden now they're allowed to bring the korban pesach. No, but if the other way around, that they're already tamei tumas hameis, and as tamei tumas hameis they were allowed to bring the korban pesach, but now all of a sudden they become zavs. Look, even though they were tamei, as tamei tumas hameis, they were allowed to bring korban pesach, even when they become zavs, still as tamei people they can bring the korban pesach. But v'akati lo dami. But still, to suggest that since Ula says that by Mitzorah, who's also about Kerik, who's also Tvuyom, he's allowed to stick his hands into Azara, that would not mean that by Korban Pesach, when the majority is Tamei Tumas Hameis, and then it becomes Zavs, that they would be allowed to bring the Korban Pesach. Why not? Vakati lo dami, they're still not similar because Mitzorah had Teirahu. Hov Ishtri. Says Abai, look, by Mitzorah it's completely mutter. Meaning, the Torah says, yes, I recognize that this person is still is Mitzorah. He's not fully purified from being a Mitzorah. The Torah is telling us, you have this person who is Tamei. He's still a Mitzorah. He's not fully purified yet. Still, the Torah says, this Tamei person should go and stick his hands into Azar. And it's mutter. It's not like, really, it's b'di'evet. This is just how it works. You have Mitzorah as part of his purification process. As a mechusar kippurim, he goes and sticks his hands into Azar. It's permitted. It's just the way that it goes. And now he's a tvul yom. Okay. Part of the way that Mitzorah works is that you have Tumah, you have tamei person sticking his hands into the Azara. That's just the way that it goes. However, it's a whole history. So since as a Mitzorah, he's permitted as a tamei person to stick his hands into the Azara, if it's permitted, it's permitted. And now the fact that he's a Tvul Yom, whatever, it's permitted. In the context of Mitzorah, it's permitted. But Tumah dechuya he. But when it comes to the Tumah by Korban Pesach, when you have most of Am Yisrael tamei tumas hameis, and we say, okay, you could bring the korban pesach b'tumah. Tumah dechuya ibetzibur. We had seen the other day tumah hutra ibetzibur. That would be similar to like what Abaye is saying by mitzorah, that it's mutter. Right? One way to view it would be that if the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei tumas hameis, and now it's Erev Pesach, it's mutter. It's completely mutter. They can offer the korban pesach. It's completely allowed. The other way to look at it is tumah dechuya ibetzibur. That look, the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei. As tamei people, they're not allowed to bring the korban pesach. They're tamei, but because since it's the majority of Am Yisrael, we say, you know what? There is the concept of the tzitz being meratzeh, that even as tamei people, they're going to offer the korban pesach, but the tzitz will be meratzeh for tumas sakodshim. And it would be, and since it's the majority of Am Yisrael, you know what? Tumah dechuya b'tzibur, it's b'di'evid. We don't want tamei people to bring korbanos, but since it's the majority of the tzibur, they can do it. So while by mitzorah it's permitted, it's completely allowed, by korban pesach it's tumah dechuya ibetzibur, it's b'di'evid. So laha idchay, laha lo idchay. And therefore, in this scenario where the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei tumas hameis, and then they also become tamei tumas ziva, so while when the majority is tamei tumas hameis, then while the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei tumas hameis, we say, okay, fine, you could bring the korban pesach. It's not ideal, but okay, it's fine. But now when they become tamei tumas ziva, they're all zavs. So we say, okay, this is too much. You got to bring the korban pesach. You have to bring the pesach sheni. So Rav Yosef wanted to say that since Ula says that by a mitzorah he's allowed to stick his hands into Azara, well then, even if he's a Tvuyom, it's also okay. Well, that's because by Mitzorah, it's completely mutter for him to stick his hands into Azara. But to then extend that to Korban Pesach and say that if they're tamei, if the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei tumas hameis, since they can bring the Korban Pesach as being tamei tumas hameis, also if they become tamei tumas ziva, also they could still bring the Korban Pesach, because you could just bring the Pesach in a state of Tumah now. No, Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. It's b'di'evet to begin with that the majority of Am Yisrael is bringing the Korban Pesach b'tumah. When they now become tumas zavin, forget it. It's not going to be extended to that. They're going to have to bring Pesach sheni. Omer le Rave, but Rave argues against it, and he says Adarab. No, I'll say punkt fakir. If Chamistarva, the opposite makes sense. Mitzorah heteru lo ishtaru lo ishtaru. Look, Mitzorah, where we're saying that a mitzorah on the 8th day is allowed to stick his hands into the Azara. And we're saying it's permitted specifically for Azara, for a mitzorah. I wouldn't assume that you can just now extend it to also allow a tvuyom to stick his hands into the Azara. That would be a big chiddush, because we're saying that a tamei person normally can't stick his hands into the Azara, but by a mitzorah it's permitted. Wow, it's a big chiddush. I would only assume that it's permitted just for a mitzorah, that's it. I wouldn't necessarily assume that, okay, we're also going to permit it for a tvul yom. And the way I understood it from the note in the art scroll is basically the lot, because it's a little bit tricky, but basically the lot, this is the way I understand it, is that, and yet, we do allow it for a tvul yom, as we saw in the Brisa. So therefore, if in a situation by mitzorah where we say that it's mutter, and I would assume that it would only be mutter for a mitzorah, we can't just say that it's mutter to other things as well. And yet we do say that a tvul yom can, right, if he becomes a balkari, goes to nikva, is it now tvul yom, it's still okay. Well then certainly, Tumah dechuya mali chad dechuya mali shtei dechuyos. No, when it comes to the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei tumas hameis, and we say Tumah dechuya b'tzibur, even though it's b'di'evid, look, everyone's tamei. You have the whole Am Yisrael is now, or majority of Am Yisrael is going to be offering korban pesach b'tumah. But we say, okay, look, the fact of the matter is, tzitz will be meratzeh. So, if we'll say that tzitz will be meratzeh for tumas amei, so we can also say that tzitz will be meratzeh for tumas ziva as well. And we say if it's dechuya for, if we're saying anyways that it's dechuya for Tumas Ames, we'll say that it's dechuya for Tumah Ziva as well, argues Rava. And finishes the Gemara, and as a side note, we see that both Abaye and Rava assume that we say Tumah dechuya hi b'tzibur as opposed to Tumah hutra b'tzibur, right? Both Abaye and Rava seem to agree with that. Abaye said that Korban Pesach is Tumah dechuya b'tzibur, and we say that it's only dechuya for Tumah Sameis, not for Tumah Ziva. Rava says, no, we could say that if it's Tumah dechuya for Tumah Sameis, it's also dechuya for Tumah Ziva, but they both assume Tumah dechuya b'tzibur, not Tumah hutra b'tzibur. The nafkamina in terms of the machlokas, right? Is it hutra b'tzibur? Is when the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei? Does it mean that the Tumah is completely mutter? Excuse me, and it's completely mutter to not bring the Korban Pesach? B'tumah, or does it mean it's dechuya, it's b'diavad, but we do it anyways because it's the majority of Am Yisrael. So if in terms of is it dechuya or hutra, well, Abaye and Rava both agree that it is dechuya. So if we're looking for majority rules, add them to the side that says dechuya b'tzibur as opposed to hutra b'tzibur. Chever, that was Daf Lamed Beis of Masechta Zevachim. On Daf Lamed Beis of Masechta Zevachim, we began the third parak of Masechta Zevachim. We learned a new Mishnah that discussed Avodah done by people that are pasul. This would be Zorim, Nashim, Avodim, Tameim. The Gemara then discussed Shechita Bizar, right? Mikabala va'elach, mitzvahs, kihuna, which teaches Limer al Shechita sheksher bizar, b'chol adam, that Shechita can be done by Zorim, Nashim, Avodim. We did say, however, that by Tameim it's really b'diavad because we are concerned about the meat about the korban becoming tamei, but Shechita is allowed by psulim. Only from Kabbalah and onwards does it need to be a kohen. Then we talked about Shechita being done by a tamei person. We said that it is asur midirabanon, so as not to risk contaminating kodshim, as I just mentioned. We discussed partial entry of tamei persons into the temple. Ula says osur and chayiv makis. Okay, so Ula had said that a partial entry is right bia b'miktzas shema bia, and that you be chayiv makis for it because b'chol kodesh lo siga vela mikdash lo savo. It says by yoledes, and just like partial touching of kodesh is also, so also partial going into the mikdash is also. So therefore you be chayiv makis. We assume that you would also be chayiv kares for that as well. We then had this whole scenario with a mitzora and day 8 who also becomes a balkari, and he goes to the mikvah, now he's a tful yom, and we say that he's allowed to get his purification and stick his hands into the azar, because since it's allowed for mitzora, it's also allowed for, even though he's a tful yom as well, which then got into this whole question about what do we say when you have majority of Am Yisrael is tamei and it's time to bring the korban Pesach. They were tamei tumas hametz, but then they also become zovs. What happens? So Abaye says that while by a mitzvah we said that since he's allowed as a mitzvah, he's also allowed even though he's a tvul yom. That's because mitzvah is permitted. But when it comes to the korban pesach, the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei. It's tumah dechuya b'tzibur, and it's only dechuya by tamei meis. It's not dechuya by tumas ziva. Rava says fakert that when it comes to Tumah dechuya b'tzibur, if it's dechuya for Tumas Ames, and we'll rely upon the tzitz to be maratza, we could follow that through also with Zavim as well, and say that if they were majority of Am Yisrael was Tomei Tumas Ames, and then became Tomei Tumas Ziva, they would still be able to offer the Korban Pesach. Cheved, that was Daf Lamed Beis, Daf 32 of Masechta Zevachim. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.